the road again. Just can't wait to get on the road again. The life I love is making music with my friends. And I keep...
Good message on Thanksgiving right there, isn't there? But I'm still going to preach. This is the last of my series on the road again with Jesus this morning, and we're going to talk about gratitude. There is a story in the Gospels in John chapter 9 about Jesus intervening with someone and the response being a response of gratitude. It's a brief story of a healing of a blind man, but much of the chapter, this story covers the entire chapter, revolves around how people respond to this blind man being healed. And there's a lot to learn from this little story. So let's begin in verses 1 to 3, the meeting. As Jesus was walking along, he saw a man who had been blind from birth. Teacher, his disciples asked him, why was this man born blind? Was it a result of his own sins or those of his parents? It was not because of his sins or his parents' sins, Jesus answered. He was born blind so the power of God could be seen in him. Now, as Jesus walks through the temple gate, he sees a blind man, and it was a very popular place for handicapped people to gather to try to get people to help them with alms, because that's the only way they survived. Many would be there every day, and probably the disciples had seen this man before. He might have been a very familiar scene. Now, the way Jesus focused his eyes on him caught the attention of his disciples. This is another one of those occasions where the intensity of Jesus' gaze attracted attention. As I've said before, probably one of the most dominant features, physical features of Jesus was his eyes. His eyes. They were powerful. There was something about his gaze, his eyes, that was overwhelming to onlookers. Eyes that could gaze with self-evident compassion, eyes that could blaze with the righteous indignation of a holy God. Powerful eyes. Now, also behind this story, the Jews believed that a man's suffering was directly connected with his sin. The more he sinned, the more he suffered. That's actually the story that you get in the book of Job, dealing with that very subject. However, when one was born handicapped, then who sinned? The child couldn't have sinned in the womb, so then you have to blame the parents. Well, it must be the parents' fault. See, they're always trying to find fault, so the blame shifted to the parents. Now, Jesus' answer here was, it's neither of those, okay? It's neither of those. The glory of God will be revealed through the handicap of this individual, his blindness. Now, notice the difference in reaction between the response of Jesus and his disciples. When they saw the man, they asked, how did he get this way? When Jesus saw him, he said, what can we do for him? Quite a difference. The disciples wanted a discussion on who's to blame, and Jesus wanted to focus on how can we help. A lot to learn right there. A lot to learn right there. So the healing happens in verses 6 and 7. Then Jesus spit on the ground, made mud with the saliva, and smoothed the mud over the blind man's eyes. He told him, go and wash in the pool of Siloam, and Siloam means sent. So the man went and washed and came back seeing. Now, we're not specifically told why Jesus did what he did to heal this man. We know in Matthew chapter 20, verse 34, he heals a blind man simply by touching his eyes. So what's going on here? It would seem strange to us, this whole story at this particular point seems a little strange to us, and even repulsive and unhygienic. But it was very common in the first century. People of that day believed that saliva had curative qualities to it, that it had healing qualities to it. Ever burn your finger and stick it in your mouth? It's kind of a natural reaction. Well, they believed that it had healing powers. Now, I don't believe Jesus thought it had any curative powers. We already know that that wasn't a limitation on his powers, but he may have done it to gain the confidence of the blind man. Jesus was about to give him a command that would be a test of obedience, and to kind of set him up for that, he was trying to build his confidence in what Jesus was about to do. Now, there's something really important to learn here, I think, and that is this. The best way to start with someone is to start relationally and not with the truth. Sometimes the truth has to come after a relationship is built. If you know someone who isn't a follower of Jesus and you're interested in them, the best thing you can do for them is to be a friend. Just be a friend. No conditions. No conditions. Just be a friend. In that way, maybe at some point, you'll earn the right to speak truth. The worst thing we can do is speak truth first, because usually that's done without love. And as the scripture says, we're to speak the truth in love. And that's what Jesus is doing here. Jesus isn't speaking truth yet. He's just seeing if this man is going to follow him enough to be healed. Later on, there's going to be some truth. So we'll go through that as we work through this. Now, there's also another thing going on here, and there's some symbolical significance to Jesus sending him to the pool of Siloam. In Isaiah 8:6, the waters of the pool are a symbol of the spiritual blessings which flow from God's dwelling place. So it was symbolic of the source of spiritual blessing. Now, the meaning of the word Siloam, as it says there in verse 7, is sent. One of the key themes of the Gospel of John is that Jesus is the one sent by the Father. As a matter of fact, this idea of Jesus being sent by the Father is repeated 20 times in the Gospel of John. So it is one of the themes of John. Jesus is sent by the Father. And so you put those two together, and we see in Jesus the true Siloam, the one sent by the Father to cleanse us of our sins. So there's a whole lot going on in this little story. Now, the interesting thing, it says he went, that's a past tense. He washed, past tense, and he came back seeing, present tense. Very intense. He went, he washed, and now he sees. Powerful, powerful healing there. Can you imagine what it might have been like for him? It probably changed his entire countenance, as we're going to see, as people start trying to respond to this guy and what has gone on. Now, the reaction here, I'm going to kind of work through the rest of this chapter. Some of it you don't have in your handout, so just kind of follow with me here. But when you get tired, go back and read the whole chapter. It gets kind of humorous here as we get into what's going on. So let's go start with verse 8. His neighbors and others who knew him as a blind beggar asked each other, "Is this the same man, that beggar?" Now see, something looks different. Some said he was, and others said, "No, but he surely looks like him." And the beggar kept saying, "I am the same man. Hello, I'm here. It's the same man." So he's constantly trying to convince people as he goes through this. They asked him, "Who healed you? What happened?" He told them, "The man they called Jesus made mud, smoothed it over my eyes, and told me, 'Go to the pool of Siloam and wash off the mud.' I went, I washed, and now I see." Now, this is the first time he says this. Watch how many times he has to say it through this passage. Very interesting. "Where is he now?" they asked. "I don't know," he replied. Now, the Pharisees asked him, now the Jewish religious leaders get involved. They asked him all about it. So he told them, "He smoothed mud over my eyes, and when it was washed away, I could see." Number two, the second time he says it. Then the Pharisees, in verse 17, the Pharisees once again questioned the man who has been born blind and demanded, "This man who opened your eyes, who do you say he is?" The man replied, "I think he must be a prophet." The Jewish leaders still refused to believe the man had been blind and could now see, so they called in his parents. They asked them, "Is this your son? Was he born blind? If so, how can he now see?" His parents replied, "We know this is our son, that he was born blind, but we don't know how he can see or who healed him. Ask him. He's old enough to speak for himself." Now, it says that they were afraid to say anything because if you said anything positive about Jesus, you'd be thrown out of the synagogue. So that was their fear at this particular point. So they would not say, they wouldn't go any further. So for the second time, the Pharisees called this poor guy back in who was blind and told him, "Give glory to God, but tell him the truth because we know Jesus is a sinner." Whoa. Well, the man says, "I don't know whether or not he's a sinner, but I know this." Guess what? The third time, "I was blind and now I see." I was blind and now I see. "But what did he do?" they asked. "How did he heal you?" "Look," the man exclaimed, "I told you once, didn't you listen? Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to be his disciples too?" Now he starts egging them on. I love this guy. He's going to have some fun with them now. Then they just cursed him. I mean, they really got angry. They cursed him and said, "You're his disciples, but we're disciples of Moses. We know God spoke to Moses, but we don't even know who this man is or where he came from." "Why, that's very strange," the man replied. "He healed my eyes," fourth time he says it, "and you don't know where he comes from? We know that God doesn't listen to sinners, but he is ready to hear those who worship him and do his will. Ever since the world began, no one has been able to open the eyes of someone born blind. If this man were not from God, he couldn't have done it. Boy, he preaches a little sermon to these guys. Well, they're even madder now. You were born a total sinner, they answered. Are you trying to teach us? And they threw him out of the synagogue. Remember, this is going on in the synagogue. Don't you just love this guy? He just keeps coming back with his own simple witness. I was blind, now I see. He drove the Pharisees crazy, and Jesus was already driving them crazy. They were not open to a movement of God in their midst because guess who is blind in this story? It's the Pharisees, not this man. They're the ones blind. They're blind to a work of God because it was done on the Sabbath, and their legalism was blocking them there. And their prejudice, well, he must have been a sinner because he was blind. So their prejudice about the sin of this man was also blocking and making them blind to a work of God right in front of them. Right in front of them. Now, if we think about it for a moment, I think we'll find that this man was profoundly thankful for what Jesus had done for him. He just keeps repeating it. And remember, now, he still doesn't yet know really who Jesus is, okay? He wasn't trying to analyze it like the Pharisees or the neighbors or the disciples. He simply said in response to the question, I went, I washed, and now I see. Gratitude is a powerful force in our life if we practice it. And it gives us several things. Let me mention a few. First of all, there's the discovery of grace. Of grace. This man had been blind his entire life, probably regularly stood outside that temple begging alms. And on this momentous day, Jesus walks by. The blind man has nothing to do with his healing other than obeying Jesus. It was a work of grace. And if you read right at the end of the chapter, here's where the truth, remember I told you Jesus started where he was, and then he leads him to truth. At the end of that chapter, Jesus finds him. Now, he may have been looking for Jesus, but Jesus finds him. And Jesus says, do you believe in the Son of Man? Do you believe in the Messiah? Is what he's asking. And the man said, yes. And Jesus said, I am he. Do you believe? And the man said, I believe, and fell and worshiped Jesus. Wow, what a story. What a story. Now remember, all the other things he said before he ever really truly knew who Jesus was. He just knew that he was a man of God. Gratitude allows us to discover grace in our life on a daily basis. It is a great way to get our eyes off ourselves, to discover grace. You know, we need to constantly think. The more we can think about gratitude every day of our life, the closer we will walk with God, and the more we won't get wrapped up in the things of this world. Which leads us to the second thing, and that is gratitude gives us the right focus in life. Notice all the wrong focus here. The disciples were focused on who sinned. The neighbors had doubts about whether or not it was the guy that was there before. The Pharisees attacked Jesus. But what was the blind man focused on? I was blind and now I see. He had the right focus. The best way to miss the blessings of God and his presence in our life is to have the wrong focus. To spend too much time in the future or too much time in the past and miss the present. Miss the present, where we can truly express gratitude. I believe God visits us often. We're just focused on the wrong things and we miss it. So gratitude is a great way to correct our focus. When I start thinking about things I shouldn't be thinking about, when I start getting the negative attitude about things that are happening in my life, if I will just stop for a moment and focus on gratitude, it will change my perspective. It will change my perspective. And I'll remember like this guy did, oh, I was blind and now I see. I'm sure he said that for the rest of his life. For the rest of his life. Which leads us to the third thing about truth. Discern truth. Gratitude helps us to discern truth. The blind man wasn't led astray by the Pharisees and their wrong focus and their untruth about Jesus. He was just grateful for what Jesus had done for him. The biggest thing that gratitude can do for us relative to discerning truth is to discern truth about ourselves. Discern truth about ourselves. One of the things that Jesus always wants to teach us, what God always wants to teach us, is more about himself, more about Jesus, more about God, and more about ourselves. The more we learn that truth, the more we will discover grace and move toward gratitude. To harbor untruth about ourselves will keep us off the journey with God and harm all of our relationships. Harm them all. We can't be healed until we face the truth. And the truth is extremely important in all of these experiences. I remember as a child, I grew up in a fairly poor neighborhood, and we lived in a really small home. It was a little two-bedroom house and had a one-car garage. It was built behind the house. It was just on a little lot in the city, and the houses were really close together. And our neighbors right next to us, which, of course, you could always hear your neighbors when they talked. Our neighbors right next to us, there was a husband and wife, and they had a small boy, and they were both alcoholics. Now, I didn't know what an alcoholic was when I was young. I was about 10, I guess. But these two would fight. I mean, they would fight. So I used to hide out in the garage behind the house and watch them fight. They usually we didn't have air conditioning in those days, so they'd have the kitchen door open, and they would fight in the kitchen. And so I got to stand out there. Hopefully they didn't see me, and watch them fight. I mean, they would fight. They would hit each other. Well, one day, she pulled out a butcher knife and stabbed him in the stomach. We had the cops out there in the hospital sending an ambulance, sent him to the hospital. He lived, sent him back home, and it was a little bit before they fought again. But of course, I was waiting because I kind of enjoyed the fights. And my dad intervened. My dad went over to the house and started talking with them and just befriending them, I guess, is what he was doing. I really didn't know he was doing this because, remember, I'm just a kid. He's going over doing this. And over a little period of a time, he led them to the Lord. They became professing Christians. And I mean, the fighting stopped, the drinking stopped, everything stopped, ruined my entertainment. I had to talk to my dad about that. These two people completely changed. And we would go over to their house, we'd be sitting around talking. I mean, they were calm. I mean, it was just amazing. It was amazing. Even to me as a young child, I said, boy, what in the world? I couldn't believe what happened. But my dad helped them discern truth. And as they discerned truth, they came to be believers in Jesus, but he was a friend first. He was a friend first. So the fourth thing that gratitude does for us is it allows us to experience joy. I don't see anyone else in this chapter joyful but the blind man. He seemed to be having a great deal of fun, giving the Pharisees a hard time, and constantly repeating, I was blind, now I'm healed. If we express gratitude for what we have rather than complaining or focusing on what we don't have, we will experience joy. I don't think you will find a joyful person who's not a person of gratitude. Those two things are intimately connected. We just won't be joyful unless we're people of gratitude. But if we are people of gratitude, it will move us toward joy. On the other hand, people with sour attitudes are not joyful people. And they're not people you really want to be around. The power of gratitude is one of the most powerful forces in our life. Back to that verses in Philippians 4, 6 and 7. Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus.
3, 4. On the road again. Just can't wait to get on the road again. The life I love is making music with my friends.